Borislav.
Okay, so probably you heard about the company. If not, we'll be happy if this is your first time. My background is in semantic annotation, information extraction, NLP, this type of stuff. The background of the company as a whole is combining, on one hand side, semantic databases. So we're the producer of GraphDB, an RDF or a RDF database or a triple store. Sometimes we kind of call it also just a NoSQL graph database. Depends who's hearing this. Yeah, but we combine two worlds. So one is really text analytics, the other is semantic representation of data and management of such data. So for the last 15 years, we're actually trying to prove to the world that these two worlds should go together. And so these two paradigms in technology actually belong together. So I was asked not to talk about, let's say, what we do, not to sell you anything. So that's why I'll start from one more conceptual perspective, and then I will show you some, let's say, recent experiments that we did around the Panama leaks and so on. So over the years, we have found out that, as I said, the combination of text analytics plus semantic representation of data are very valuable for various industries. So we work a lot in the publishing industry, including media organizations, but also a lot of scientific publishers, but also pharma companies in the same time, sometimes government organizations and so on. But over the years, let's say there is a new piece in this stack. So some of you have seen the first two pieces, so the, let's say, semantic representation of data. On the second level is what we nowadays tend to call semantic enrichment. But you can hear it under various terms. It could be semantic annotation, information extraction, just natural language processing, whatever. It means the same thing. In this context, it is semantic just because it is driven off the semantic database and it represents its results back in the semantic database, something which is key. And in the last couple of years, the things which we are really excited about are what we call, let's say, behavior-driven personalizations. There are clients also in the room that use this. I'm not sure that I can say who they are, but in any way, this is the third layer. So you can simplify this of saying on the level of data, it's natural to aim to represent this data in a more semantic way, which means capturing a bit of the meaning. On the level of content or different assets, because sometimes this would be multimedia content, not necessarily textual one, then you would have semantic annotation or semantic enrichment of this content. This producing a holistic index, when you have a user on top, then you would already try to capture what this user does, what is the behavioral profile, and on this basis capture what they call nowadays psychographics, so not demographics. Yeah? So how this data layer looks like in a simplified way, I have prepared also, let's say, a diagram that can give you a walkthrough, but it cannot really fit on a PowerPoint slide. So, so typically what you would have, there are three layers. So one layer would be the schema or the ontology, so the domain model in some terms you can say. You have also the instance data, or where you put the facts. Yeah? The individual entity profiles of the world that you try to describe. Sometimes this would be, let's say, linked open data profiles, but sometimes it will be profiles that are actually from real proprietary data. Still linked data, I like this new term connected data, because linked data already carries a bit too much from this open world, and for some enterprises this is definitely a no-go still. And then on the last layer, let's say, we'll have the semantic fingerprints, as we call them, or this would be the enriched profiles of assets that you annotate. This could be news articles, could be different types of documents, and so on. So in order to show you how this actually looks like in a very simplified vision of, let's say, concept extraction pipeline, so you have a very simple sentence like Jim works for the International Monetary Fund. The important part is what happens in the beginning and also what happens in the end, more or less. So what happens in the beginning is that automatically such a text analytics pipeline knows what you have in your semantic database. So it has access to the different entity profiles that you have described there according to your domain model. As an output, what it produces would be that circle micrograph there. So this, let's say, as if you throw the document into your semantic database, and through this concept extraction, it automatically links to all the entities which are mentioned inside. So this creates such a holistic index, you can say, that you don't only have your data, but your content is also through this process connected to it. Of course, in the middle, there are many niceties like machine learning, curation-driven continuous adaptation, and so on. But probably we don't have the time for this. And just to give you a little bit of taste of this personalization, this is an example for a concrete client of the different types of user actions that we capture in order to step-by-step accumulate a user profile based on the, let's say, semantic fingerprint of these documents with which the user interacts. So this will be different direct actions, like somebody votes for something or posts some new content, or it would be more indirect, let's say, search scenario or research scenario in which the user posts some query and then on this basis chooses one of the results, which is also very indicative not only for the article the user chose, but also for the ranking of the other articles that were shown to you. And maybe to keep it less abstract, so to bring it back to the, let's say, level in which is probably even more interesting, we can try just to show you a small thingy that we run from our website. So it's based on public news. It is something that we call news on the web, or in short it is now. It is just a simple representation of what we very often deliver to our clients, you can say. Of course, we are not a UI company, so we have just a couple of UI engineers and about 70 backend guys, which are producing all the products. So that's why we don't have all the different ideas and sometimes different things that our clients implement here. But it is driven by public news, and you can navigate and just see for one specific news article the different types of entities that are automatically extracted. In the back end of this thing, you have DBpedia plus Wikidata plus geonames, consolidated by us, uniquely identified on the level of each entity profile with another URI that represents our view on this world. And then you can see also different types of entities or relationships. Maybe I should zoom this in a bit. So very concrete geographic locations or relationships, like finding that somebody is a spokesman and so on. You have different types of contextual recommendations, in this case not behavior driven. We never had the time to introduce the user concept here, and different mentions of entities. So something which is probably a bit more interesting here would be if we go into some of the other channels, like sports. You can search for the different types of trends, for example, for the last week. So automatically capture the trends and see, okay, what are the top entities. The type of news articles we capture here are a bit US biased. So this is just the way we define the news feed. It's not necessarily representative, but you see Portugal, for example, you see Serena Williams, who also won a championship title and so on. And the other type of things, I don't know, UFC, probably something happened as well there. But this gives you an idea of how this concrete, let's say, profile that you are capturing by the individual concepts that you find in the text can build such a metadata fingerprint that allows you to interconnect your data and content and drive different types of search mechanisms or statistics. And finally, it's probably interesting just to see one concrete organization profile, or you can do the same for people. It's a public service. So you can see different types of popularity timelines, or you can see different types of, let's say, dashboard-like widgets that give you an idea of let's say, based on co-occurrence, what types of entities you can assume are related to this organization. In this case, it doesn't make much sense. It's just because Twitter talks about these guys, but you can look for one, let's say, a business entity, which will probably be a bit more convincing. So, yeah, I mean, I would say this is something that you can explore also yourselves. Sometimes you see also other relationships, not only based on relationship between people and organizations, but also acquisitions between organizations and so on. So maybe back to the overall presentation. So I'm already half of the time. So I'll start telling you what we did around this Panama leaks and so on. So we started off something that we called FactForge, and it's a collection of DBpedia geonames, a bit more rich, let's say, from the relation point of view compared to the data set that is needed to run, for example, this news-related showcase. But we threw at it also a lot of news articles, and on this basis we have accumulated almost 100 million statements just as news metadata. So in the end it became something like a billion statements data set. So the technology that is used to actually connect these news articles with this data set you already saw, so it is based on concept extraction. The actual news metadata and the different types of entities which are mentioned inside, we have included some links that you can see in the presentation later. But in this case, I don't believe it is so important for this talk. Maybe the only thing which is important is to see on the right-hand side, from your point of view, you have organization, locations, and people. So these are number 2, 3, and 4. And what was always our theory for the last 12 years at least is that these type of entities for general purpose news articles, including the whole range between political pieces and sports news, they're quite well distributed, so they're mentioned the same amount of time. So this drives completely different type of motivation in us, why in some cases even managed data services are important. In some cases we believe that during the next years we will see also such managed services for people, organization, and location data to be something like a commodity maybe. We see a lot of our clients actually wasting huge amount of time and sometimes just not finishing the complete cycle from the entire view of managing the data, updating it, and also later curating and maintaining the text analytics. So such services might be helpful for them as well at some point. This was just an insight that we got from this data. So here we have some sample queries. Maybe I can show you some, although I'm not sure how much you see because the screen is probably a bit small for this type of thing. But yes, you will get the presentation. There is also a data onto text.com. It's a description of this work. But you can see some of the queries and play directly with them. So for example, one of the insights in this data set, I'm not explaining so much about the Panama leaks because I expect that 99% of the people, which in this case means everybody, read something about it. But in this case we are trying to capture, okay, what are the ownership relationships between a company and a subsidiary, for example, between different countries. So this is not a surprise. You can see the result on the right-hand side. It's not a surprise that for China it will be Hong Kong. It's probably a surprise that for Hong Kong it will be the British Virgin Islands. So there are such interesting things like the relationship between Taiwan and Samoa and so on. So a lot of things that people can explore. Of course, our colleagues, in this case, most of the vision behind this was actually by Atanas Kirakov, who is the founder of On2Text. But let's say he checked just things which are interesting for him. But I expect that that it is possible to find new things just by understanding the model. We have published also and open sourced all the components that were used to ingest this data, transform it into RDF, do the proper mapping and so on. I'll explain a bit more about this later. So another query that I just started while speaking was, okay, what are the number of entities of companies that have something to do with offshore companies, but the companies originally coming from Eastern Europe. So in this case, there is a big difference between the Russian Federation, but also Ukraine is quite in the top things. So the others are much, like for example, Slovakia seem to be almost without any offshore entities. So probably to go a bit further so that we have a chance to get some questions. We have included in this presentation also different types of rankings. Some of these queries we can show you also live, which are showing a bit more about the differences in popularity between organizations if you take into account their subsidiaries or if you don't. Both in the automotive, the financial sector, these industrial sectors, we have done the mapping ourselves. It was a bit of domain modeling job, just because it was too diverse in DBpedia, for example. And probably just a few words about the actual offshore leaks database. So it was published, but not including only the Panama Papers. It included also stuff which was released in 2003. So this whole thing goes as offshore leaks. The domain model was not so complicated when you look at the class level. So you can see that there are just companies, different types of country information, address information, jurisdiction information, and of course people which are playing something there as officers and so on. Of course, when you look deeper, it is much more complicated. So, and this is even in the case that from these Panama leaks, not all the data was published. It was probably just a few %. So, of course, we are obliged to put a disclaimer in such a place where we link to such a public data service. But on the other side, one of the reasons to show it is that I have heard from people in the media industry that it will be very nice and for them to have public services in which they can play with such leaks, just because it is often not very clear whether they are allowed to do this in-house in their media organization. So this is something that could be used. Of course, this is, now we have Brexit, we have all kinds of different, let's say, news, so everybody more or less forgot about Panama, but it is interesting to know for the next time, because we believe that in the next years it will be more and more leaks coming out. It's just obviously a tendency recently. So I have 3 minutes from my time, so I'm trying to see what makes sense. The interesting part is maybe that the RDF, so the components that did the ETL and transformed the original CSV dumps into RDF are public now, so you can use them. They're open sourced. As you see, our colleagues spent about 15 days in this, but actually the calendar time for which this data service was prepared was 3 calendar days. So in a way, it just shows with linked open data, combining it with new data that just emerged through these leaks, how fast you can merge these together and actually consolidate them. Of course, you should know what you're doing, but also in combination with such a new service as the one that we've showed, or access to such a news feed, plus concept extraction, plus semantic annotation, then you can link this newly consolidated data also with mentions in the news. So in reality, this was not so popular in the news, just because usually the type of companies that you see coming from offshore zones don't have news coverage. Yeah? So there were just about 300 mentions. For the people, though, it was not exactly the same. So it was 10 times more people that are involved in such offshore companies, which we have to admit is not always illegal. Then much more people were actually mentioned. So we can decide now, I can show you a bit more queries and talk especially about the type of rankings, for example, that we have done there. So very similar to, for example, what page rank was for Google some time ago. Now there are, of course, many more ranking mechanisms. In a similar way, we support something which we call RDF rank for many years already. So this calculation of the popularity of an entity or a concept in a graph. Then on this basis, of course, you can order the results by it and so on. So maybe I start with questions and then we decide whether to switch to the demos.
Do you have any questions before we start?
Or you just decided that we keep everything for the panel session?
Well, I mean, it's up
As you
to you. I
prefer,
mean, if you've got something you'd like to show us now, Boris.
Yes, sir.
Regarding this tagging system and
Yeah.
so what's the complexity of facts that you can tag automatically? I mean, it's not only the named entities, right?
That's-
It goes beyond, but is there any specified?
Yeah, that's correct. So the types of, maybe I just show you briefly one of the, so we just pick an article and then we can talk on concrete examples. So there are not many relationships in this one, but let's see something else. Yeah, so for example, this would be the most simple type of things which are on top of named entities. So this would be a concrete role of a person. Yeah. So this would be this guy is doing this thing. In this demo, exactly, we have things which are only focused on relationships between people and organizations. So it could be an M&A deal between two organizations, for example. In other scenarios, so in life sciences, primarily in pharma, not so much in healthcare, we also have a lot of implementations for big companies. We cannot really say who. But in the financial services domain, we have quite a lot of analytics, even on top of macroeconomic reports, where you capture the views of the economist on the specific market within a certain horizon. So you could say this goes to the level of events on some compound entities which are like relationships but a bit more complicated. So I would say probably pretty similar to what our colleagues from Manchester can do. So we've met a lot in the past, so I guess. Yeah, but let's say, of course, many people do text analytics. We believe that what we give is, on one hand side, is the machine learning is quite a lot of its internal R&Ds, and we claim that it is quite innovative. But also the combination of the RDF representation of the data, of the semantic representation of the data, the different types of ranks that we can capture, and of course the capability to adapt the machine learning based on human feedback. And human feedback that is with entities that are identifiable, so they're not just on the level of type, but on the level of individual references. So, yeah. But, I mean, we encourage you to speak to us later. 20 minutes, not so much time. Thanks for the chance, of course, Nigel.
Thank you, Boris. And apologies to give you
Yeah,
a sense of urgency.
Thanks.